Welcome back to the Sacred Acts podcast from the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I'm Reverend Randy Partain.
And I'm Alan Georgia.
And we have kind of a wrap-up of our Ask Us Anything questions today, kind of closing out Season 1, and hopefully Season 2 will involve your voices as well as we discuss some of the spiritual practices that you find meaningful.
I'm very excited about the questions we have for today. I am also excited about opening this conversation to other voices and other experiences. So today's a really exciting one. We get to jump into a lot of different areas and explore some different kinds of questions.
Absolutely. So, where should we start?
I think starting with our very first one, these are all coming from Valerie McFadden, one of our wonderful congregants here at UUCC. And Valerie asks, how has your life experience shaped your spiritual practices? Questions for all of us to consider. But Reverend Randy.
I think, I think we're going to follow up on the opposite of this in a minute, but asking how my life experience has shaped my spiritual practices, kind of flipping what we normally think about. My spiritual practices have evolved over time. I used to be in a much more Christian setting where the typical prayer and reading scripture, those kinds of things that you think about as typical spiritual practices in a Christian church were things that I engaged in. And I guess my expression of those things was externalizing a lot of stuff that I needed to be doing myself. Praying for things, praying for God to take care of things that I really needed to deal with in my life, or praying for God to manage something in my life that I wasn't taking full responsibility for. And I wasn't thinking of it like that at the time, but I think that my prayer life was not an ideal prayer life, even for a Christian to
Understood.
But my life experience of disappointment with that had invited me to re-examine it. And now I think my spiritual practices are reflective of both my awareness of the work that I still need to do in my life experience, and I can look at the things that are happening day to day or week to week and explore ways that my spiritual practices can engage in some of those challenges or some of those opportunities for deeper awareness. If I have, if I don't show up the way that I intend to show up in some place, then that life experience influences what kinds of things I'm going to take to my spiritual practices, so that I can, do better, be more in alignment with my deepest values more consistently.
Interesting.
And so my spiritual practices now, I think, are very intricately woven with my life experiences and not a separate thing. I think the other piece that I would say about life experience influencing spiritual practices, and maybe this even is part of the next question too, they're kind of connected, but realizing that my spiritual practices are not magic formulas that are going to do something to me, but they are tools for me to work with, and I need to bring all of who I am to my spiritual practices in order for them to be meaningful tools in my life. I think that has been a transformative awareness for me, that it's not just if I keep doing this thing long enough that it's going to change me somehow and I'm going to feel better. It's not going to happen that if I just do contemplative practices for enough years that suddenly I'm going to have this grand awakening and I'm going to be enlightened. I have to bring myself fully to those practices in order for them to be meaningful or useful. What about you, Alan? How has your life experience shaped your spiritual practices?
As I hear that question posed in my direction, it is so easy to think of so many dodges that I could take to avoid some of the implications of this question, because this is a very real, very serious kind of a question when I think about it. And one thing I will note is that one element of my life experience that shaped my spiritual practices has to do with the way that pursuing the things that I felt called to, or pursuing the ways that I wanted to show up in the world, that part of the life experience often put me in places that were very isolating when it came to spiritual practices. Constantly having to move, or constantly having to situate myself in a new setting or context, and kind of losing that tether. And I notice now how some of my spiritual practices were shaped by those experiences of isolation. That was a little bit of an accident. I mean, I will note that some of my moving was prompted by what I thought were spiritual goals. Like, those things were in a sense informed by each other. But when you find yourself pushing yourself in different contexts, I mean, at different times I found myself in, ideologically very diverse places. And in almost all of those places, I was not in the crew of people that were just like me. So I was often sort of on the outs with all sides. So that isolating sort of process made me certainly retreat into myself and sort of have, I would say, maybe a bit starker of a spiritual practice life than I realize now that I'm older I didn't necessarily have to fall into. Some of those things, I think, with life experience is just growing up and learning what you can and can't ask of yourself, and some of those sorts of things. But at the same time, maybe as a result, some of the practices that I lend myself to are almost like an appetite, like if you're an interior designer or something. Like, I have a little bit more of that Nordic, less is more, very kind of sharp angles and things like that. So I, especially thinking of things like in terms of contemplation and other sort of areas, maybe a little bit more focused and smaller of scale, rather than, we're sitting in Reverend Randy's office right now, and the Artist's Way book is right up there in the corner, and I have a lot of friends who are really into that process, and that's a good example of sort of what I'm saying I don't always have, is sort of that very embellished and thought out idea. For me, it's more like, the kinds of sips of water you take while traveling through the desert, which is, as I am owning right here, not necessarily the best way to analogize your spiritual life, but sometimes we are in periods where we are, more, we have to conserve, I guess. So my spiritual practices are more desert-like than they are like a verdant forest. So. This, of course, as Reverend Randy alluded to before, this is the unusual way to ask this question. It's usually, how do our spiritual practices inform our life experience?
Yes.
So now we get to ask this in the way that is more familiar, which is, sort of the reverse. Though I appreciate asking these questions in turn, because they do go both ways. So we've now talked about life experience shaping our spiritual practice. How do our spiritual practices shape our lives?
Oh, and you're wanting me to go first on that one, too?
I would like you to go first, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that if I am deprioritizing my spiritual practices, it shows up in my life. I mean, there is a direct correlation between the amount of care I give myself in terms of the spiritual practices that I engage in deeply, and the way that I show up, and how well I do at showing up the way that I want to, how good I feel at the end of the day with how the day has gone. So there's a direct relationship between whether I guess mindfully and fully engage in my spiritual practices and the way that I do everything else. So that is an effect that my spiritual practices have on my life. I also think that when I am doing well, when I am following through with the spiritual practices that I have committed to, I show up much more patient with people. I am not as easily frustrated by little things in life. I'm, I guess, much more tolerant of uncomfortable things, and maybe even painful things.
For sure.
If I am engaging in those regular spiritual practices. And I think that I am much more comfortable with not knowing things and with uncertainty when I am engaging in the contemplative practices, even the yoga practices that I engage in. I think there's a deep learning about how all things are temporary, including whatever discomfort I might be experiencing in the moment.
Understood.
So I think that it just it provides a different groundwork, a different foundation for how I do even mundane things in life when I'm engaging in those practices fully and well.
I really appreciate that idea because this idea of presentness or kind of awareness, enlightenment. There's various ways we could sort of frame it, but to me, that that mode of experiencing the world is the chief reason why the spiritual practices are present. So I appreciate hearing a little confirmation that my experience and sort of what draws me into them is so much what it is, because of course the mirror image of spiritual practices we're talking about are all these spiritual anti-practices, the spiritual things that we get pulled into and fall into. So I think that's really important to mention.
It sounds like you're saying that sometimes spiritual practices become performative rather than useful in our lives.
Very much sometimes that. Of course, I'm also thinking of things we wouldn't categorize as spiritual, but in fact are what's actually shaping our experience of the world and become these practices, habits, and how we consume things like the media or how we exist in the world that are. So I think that there are elements of both how we enact our spiritual lives in front of other people, but also how the world is sort of shaping our own spiritual selves in different ways, that the practices you're describing are so deliberate and so intentional. It's about making peace with uncertainty, but it's also taking a certain kind of ownership of your own being in the world, and that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah, and I don't do it well. I mean,
well, it's a practice, right? We're constantly working on it.
I can say that most days I start the day with yoga, but then also there are times when I will go through an entire day of overscheduling myself and then realize at the end of the day, oh, I should have created more space in this particular day of the week for a breath here and there, or just to take a little bit of a walk in between things, or just to do something that is going to not just have me careening through a set of appointments, rather than showing up fully and being mindfully present in all of the spaces where I've chosen to show up.
So this, to jump into a little theological moment, I was thinking about this as we were first framing the question. In traditional Christian theology, there is the term, this is the Latin term, but it's ex opero operare. And ex opero operare was a way of talking about, like at the time when it's conceived, it's about the idea that if somebody were to baptize you, for example, and your showing up was authentic, but the person was not approved, or they weren't a bishop or something like that.
Oh, right.
The idea is that the work is the thing that does the work. Like the ritual is the accomplisher of what's in place. It's not about the authority of the individual that's in place. And I raised that to say, I always think about it in the direction that you just sort of described, which is the idea that it's the work is what does the work. The intention doesn't matter in a sense. Your positioning doesn't matter in a sense. Like, where you are in your membership with a religious congregation is not the final point. It's like the thing that you are doing is the shaping that is happening to you. Like the work is what does the work. And so that's a really important idea to me about spiritual practices.
Well, and I guess that's one of the things that I love about Unitarian Universalist context, is that, if we do a blessing of the animals, for instance, we all have the capacity to bless whatever non-human animals we want to bless. Every moment of every day, that
Absolutely.
Capacity rests with us, whether it is the squirrel or the blue jay in my yard that I want to bless, or whether it's a furry friend that lives in my house. And there are people who really do believe that a priestly function exists with certain individuals who are appointed to do that blessing. And it's different when somebody with a collar on or somebody in a fancy hat does a thing rather than we personally do a thing. And I remember there was somebody that asked me specifically, will you bless this non-human animal at our blessing of the animals? And I of course said, yes, I will definitely do that thing. And you can do this every day. You, as a human being, are capable of doing this. And I love that empowerment to not just rely on certain individuals who are able to do the work, but to recognize that the work is all of ours to do. And it's a delight and a privilege and also a responsibility that we have to do that work.
And of course, I'm thinking of what kind of pet owners we become when we are the ones doing the blessing of our own animals, like the shaping force of those spiritual practices as they affect us. The next question poses an even more direct question to us, which is, do you pray?
So this is just like a yes or no question. We could just
ostensibly,
say,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can move right on.
I know that you do pray.
I do pray.
And I think what's going to be an interesting piece of this answer is, what does prayer look like for you? What does that mean to say that you pray? Because I would, depending on who I'm talking to, I would say, no, I don't pray, because I don't believe that there is a higher power listening and interacting with me in that way that I used to engage in petitionary prayer, for instance. But I do pray if I am able to contextualize that, because I do have a sense of what I might frame as inner divinity. I think that one of the ways that I might express the inherent worthiness that we talk about being a facet of what it is to be human, that inner worthiness could very easily make be translated by me into an inner divinity. I think that in the real moments when I am connecting the way that I want to with other human beings, I do think of it as, how would God treat God?
Oh, okay. That's a good language for that.
And in that sense, I think that there is prayer. But also in my contemplative practices, I think that I engage in what I might name a deepest, most noble self. I want to be connected with myself internally in a way that looks a lot like prayer. To have clarity about what things are mine to be responsible for and what things are mine to let go of, and to find places of peace, and to find places where there's restoration within me of the things that I feel troubled by. And so there is an internal life that is part of my spiritual existence that looks a lot like prayer, and I would even say a more authentic kind of prayer than what I used to engage in.
Understood. Well, that's... Yeah. I appreciate that you answered this yes or no question with yes and no. So
yes and no, yeah. Good Unitarian Universalist here.
But I also appreciate how part of what you're indicating is that your experience now is also in distinction to a previous practice that wasn't as meaningful for you, and that's also part of what wraps up your values around these practices now. So that's, I think, a really important thing for of course, I assume all of us have some growth process in our lives where things that used to be a certain way now don't serve us in a different way. So that's very important.
Has prayer had a similar trajectory for you, or what does prayer look like for Alan, Georgia?
So this is I believe I got to allude to this in one of our earlier conversations. By contrast, I'm happy to note this for the sake of clarity. I would say I do have a very redolent theology of a God that is in some ways we could identify in those real traditional ways. What I will note for myself is that my vision of God is very much wrapped up in the paradox of God's infinite unknowability in both Christian and honestly Islamic and in Buddhist thinking. There's this concept of the unknowing, because God is to be utterly removed. So you can't know anything about God because God is beyond the capacity of our knowledge. It's the idea that our spiritual selves are not our physical selves, and all our rationality and all that kind of stuff is not what we understand God through. So on the one hand, there's that, but the other side, of course, is this idea of the absolute nearness, the kind of, I think I might have alluded to, this is the phrase that, in fact, if I have a short prayer that I'm often speaking, it is the God is not elsewhere prayer. So God is not elsewhere. It's for me a very meaningful thing to bring into, especially those moments where my own spiritual self is very like slipping away. If it's wherever I am, if it's I was doing some shopping the other week for our Wednesday community meal at Giant Eagle. Giant Eagle is not a place I look to see God, but of course that's a place I'd then want to make sure I'm not missing how God is all around.
Absolutely.
And to me, there's a very sort of beautiful dimension of that. But then the actual practice itself is one that, on the one hand, I would say takes a shape that maybe some of us would be familiar with. In some sense, it is petitionary, but also for my own sort of theological experience, that petitioning is kind of it's kind of going through the motions because I know I'll break into this with a thing that has always stuck with me. This is actually weirdly from the Shadowlands movie, which is the movie about C.S. Lewis, and Anthony Hopkins is portraying C.S. Lewis, and there's a scene where his wife is suffering from cancer, and he's and the priest at his church, he gets some good news or something, and the priest says, "I know you've been praying so much, so God has sort of answered your prayers." And C.S. Lewis's response always sticks with me because the character responds by saying, "That's kind of ridiculous. Like the idea that I was praying and God chose this to be different is sort of not how this works." And the quote is something like, "I don't pray to change God. I pray because I can't help praying. I pray because I must pray. Like I pray because I can't begin to stop myself." And then concludes by saying, "I don't pray because it changes God. I pray because it changes me." And I've always seen that as a rubric for all of these spiritual practices, because that is what can happen when, through whatever way that we understand the larger frame of the universe, which I don't even mean to make, this could be materialist, it could be highly spiritual, it could be any other number of ways that we're framing it. But whenever we do that thing where we bring all of that together, I think we are doing prayerful work. That's my take. So do I pray? Yes. Does it look like, I don't know, Rick Warren or someone like that? I was thinking of somebody who does the prayer during the inaugurations or whatever. Like, would it look like that kind of prayer? I don't think so. Not so much. But I definitely would say that I pray. And also, I will say it's something more recently I've been working on, because to me, there's meaning to sort of spend time with that and work on it going forward.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of spaces where the impression of prayer is that it is a transactional kind of thing.
Absolutely.
And there have been Christian theologians as well as theologians and philosophers and folks from other traditions who have said that's not what prayer is, going back to...
But no, you're absolutely right. It goes very, very far back. I think of Socrates in the Phaedrus famously asked this question about does God love pious things because they're pious, or are pious things loved and good because God loves them? Like this sort of this transactional question of like what am I trying to appease here, and getting to some deeper idea of the shaping work, our participation in the world, is behind a lot of those traditions that are inviting us to think more integrally maybe about our spiritual lives.
Yeah, so that gets us to another question,
Yeah.
Unless there's more that you wanted to say about prayer.
I'm sure we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I will leave that for another episode or another conversation.
I'm sure that there are some members of our community that engage in prayer. And so we
I have
can,
no doubt.
we can talk more deeply
talk more
about
about
what that means, because
Absolutely.
it's one of those words that can mean a lot of different things to different people.
Absolutely.
So who are some of your favorite theologians, and do you have a sense of what their spiritual practices were or are?
This is like a baseball card question, where like what I really want to do is sit down with my big pack of baseball cards and show all the great players I love, and just like, oh my gosh, can you believe this one? And here's another one. So this is not exclusionary. This is just the one I'm choosing now, instead of saying favorite above all, favorite, that I'll sort of raise. What I will say is that a very profound theologian to read for me is an Eastern Orthodox theologian named Alexander Schmemann. And Alexander Schmemann was sometimes referred to as like a diaspora Orthodox, so a bunch of especially traditional, like anyone who would have been sort of a churchy family in Russia, they all were emigres. They had to leave Russia during the revolution in 1917. A lot of them ended up in France, but then lots of those theologians end up in America at some sort of later point. And of course, as you can imagine, the experience of being in Russia and then in France and then in America, that's an extraordinarily complex sort of thing to deal with. But Schmemann was, without a doubt, like the boy under the staircase of theologians, because Schmemann was a liturgical theologian, which is just like, that's not the cool kind of theologian to be. That's like the boring theologian to be. But to me, by contrast, reading Schmemann's works, so interesting. And he has this book called For the Life of the World that's all about Christian or Eastern Orthodox sacraments and framing those sacraments as these meaningful practices in our lives. And it's very sort of affecting. He has, for example, he talks about the anointing with oil that's often done for people who are very sick, a thing still common in pastoral care today, to anoint people with oil. And he comes out with his just jumps right out of the page, and his first sentence is like, "We live in a death-denying culture," and the entire chapter is about the transformed way that we experience the world if we don't put off the awareness of death. And of course, I'm just like, oh, that's so great. But I share that in terms of favorite theologians because this question about these theologians and their spiritual practices. The other thing that Schmemann ended up doing was he wrote a journal for the last 15 years of his life or something that nobody knew about. He just had a journal. And a lot of it is really interesting because it's sort of contemporary issues. This is in the late 60s into the 70s, and he's living in New York City, and he's this old at this point Orthodox figure. He's teaching at the Orthodox Seminary that's in in upstate New York, St. Vladimir's. And so you just get sort of an image into his life. And then close to the conclusion of the journal, he starts mentioning some health problems that are happening, and he's noting these in the journal. It's really quite fascinating. And then the doctor's visits, and it's very quick succession of I went to the doctor, there's a brain tumor, and there's a few of these things, and then it just stops for a year and a half. And then there's one last entry at the end. And it's basically his closing off this journal, and it's just a thing of saying, I can't even describe how luminous this year has been, this sort of final years of his life. And he's just describing how he couldn't possibly put anything in his journal because he was living so fully in his present that it was, sort of breaking out of him at every moment. But his final words in this journal are, "Oh, what happiness it has all been." And so thinking of a theologian whose work and life sort of happened to be captured at this final moment, that is a theological voice that very much sticks with me. But as I turn the question over to you, Reverend Randy, I will note I've got a lot more baseball cards, so Schmemann is great, but there's so many great other people I would also want to point to, but that's a good example. But
sure,
I will be curious to know, Reverend Randy, if you were going through your own little pack of cards here, who's a favorite theologian you would name?
Well, so there are three names that spring to mind, and one of them is probably not a surprise for a Unitarian Universalist. James Luther Adams, I think, has influenced so much of theological thought about what Unitarian Universalist theology can be. And what I love about James Luther Adams is the connection with the church, with the body of people, that our theology as Unitarian Universalists is not something that stays in an intellectual space where we philosophize and theorize about God and ask questions that are ultimately unanswerable, but
sure,
he wants to ask imminently answerable questions about where does our faith lead us in terms of our communities and the way that we engage in the world. And so it's a very practical theology, but it is a very much a values and faith-based way of doing something kind of countercultural. And I would say Starhawk is a favorite theologian for similar reasons, because Starhawk, from a pagan perspective, looks at what does this belief system, what does this faith, what does this ritual life look like when we follow it up and follow through with actions in life.
Sure.
I think I don't know if I'm attributing this correctly to Starhawk, but one of the most meaningful aspects of pagan life that I've encountered and just that I hang on to is that the most important part of a ritual is what happens afterwards.
Interesting.
Which to me is also the most important part of a prayer. If people are going to pray for something,
Sure.
then what we do after we say Amen is the most important part of that prayer, or the most important part of that ritual. And I think Starhawk exemplifies this in a lot of writings, even though I don't even know if Starhawk would call herself a theologian. But there's this sense of this needs to impact my life in a way. It can't be compartmentalized. And so thinking about that intersection. And then the third one, how very Trinitarian of me to name
That's
three
true,
theologians.
yeah.
Oh, I'm going to have
Especially
to.
because it was imposed in the question.
It was-
You decided 3.
I decided on 3. 3 is a magic number. So Thomas Merton is the other one that I would name, just because there is this recognition that a contemplative practice, a contemplative life, is even more important in a world that tries to kind of crowd out any opportunities for contemplation and introspection. And just that rooting in not just withdrawing from the world and staying there,
Sure.
but withdrawing enough to recognize why we might be engaging in the world and in what ways we want to engage in the world. And so Thomas Merton, I think, just because of the profound contemplative life, and there are a lot of other contemplatives that I would name, but I think Thomas Merton is the one that I first encountered that really struck me very deeply as this is powerful and meaningful framing of what it is to be a spiritual being.
I so appreciate that idea of contemplation as having this urgency, because so often, especially with theologians, that is the 3 that you mentioned wouldn't come together, because the idea is that to be contemplative and then to be active in the world are somehow at odds with each other. But of course, as you've just invited us to consider, so often our world is fueled by discontentments that live in our spiritual lives, and if we were more attentive to them internally, we would have less urgent problems in the actual world. These things are so often put at odds, but they really are not at odds. These are great questions, and I will note about their spiritual practices. The spiritual practices of the people we've been talking about are certainly, I would just want to note, important for the idea of our own spiritual practices, because you can't learn a thing without models. You can't learn a thing without other people in front of us. So getting to know good theologians or good spiritual figures in whatever fashion, if that's in your personal life with people you know personally, or if that's through great theologians like we're talking about, people whose books we get to read, having a model is really important. So I appreciate that part of the question.
And there are so many more we could name. I mean, that would be an interesting thing to maybe continue on with some other people. If there aren't spiritual practices that listeners want to share and have a conversation about, maybe there are some influential theologians or people that have influenced our spiritual identities in some way that we want to engage in a conversation about why.
And to your point about Starhawk, theologians can be found everywhere.
Oh, absolutely.
So many people who would be like, I'm not a theologian. I'm like, oh, but you are.
Yes.
And I can tell you because of how impactful whoever we're talking about has been, who is absolutely doing theological work, even if that's not their expressed way of being. So that's important.
Absolutely, yes.
So we have a final question that I'm quite excited to get into, but I weirdly am going to take the kernel of this question and pose it to Reverend Randy, a little bit of a doctrinal kind of a quiz that I'm going to reflect back to myself. As a UU minister in the congregation in which I am I allowed to be a Trinitarian Unitarian?
Yes. There is all permission given.
All permission given, even though it's literally the opposite of the name of the thing, that you're still saying it's okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Our names have become less and less what they originally meant as we continue to evolve as a faith tradition. So for those who are not aware, Unitarians were rejecting the idea of the Trinity. They were Unitarian because they were believing in the unity of a God and maybe a non-divine Jesus, and maybe didn't really see a point to there being a Holy Spirit defined separately from God. And so there was a sense of rejection of Trinitarian theology. A lot of Universalists were Trinitarian.
Yeah.
And so they, the further back you go,
Sure.
the more you will find Trinitarian thinking in Universalist spaces.
Understood.
But as Unitarian Universalists in the 21st century, our theologies are legion.
Yeah, understood.
So, and there's great freedom in that, because as much as we might want to define who we are so that we have a sense of our identity, and we do want to have a sense of who we are as a faith tradition, the freedom of where people find personal strength and encouragement and empowerment, I think that is as broad as how many people do we have in the room, and then some. So,
well, and also I will be quick to break in here to note that work among people who talk about this kind of stuff, so people who would actually be talking about Trinitarian theology in like a Christian context, like an official, even, like a Catholic context, a common critique is that there are no Christian Trinitarians anyway, because nobody ever does this in any meaningful way. It's never alive for people, which to me is always one of the most enduring elements of what the Unitarian Universalist presence in the world kind of does offer, which is certainly we can agree to believe different things, but also whatever you believe in should be meaningful in some way. It
That's
shouldn't
right.
just be a word on a page. But I am one of the rare people who actually does regard that the Trinity has a lot of beautiful things to sort of teach us. So the question that's been posed to us that I just got answered, I'm allowed to be authentic about, because I don't have to pretend I'm not a Trinitarian here as we answer this question. But Reverend Randy, have you ever had a favorite part of the Trinity? Or how would you answer the question of what's the best part of the Trinity in your estimation?
it's such a bizarre question and a beautiful question. So first, I'll tell another little story. When I was in seminary, there was a point in our Christian history and theological development kind of course that the Trinity was the subject, and how the Trinity is defined and how it works, and all of these different technical terms for different ways of framing the Trinity. And the professor had written these essentially 4 different competing ideas about the Trinity that were a part of the early church, the early Christian church. And the ultimate answer was that there were people in power that essentially wanted one of those to be the answer, and the other ways became heresies. And these were not valid definitions of the Trinity any longer. And my question was, so the most popular definition one, there's not an actual right answer. It's just this is the one that became orthodox, not because of any external measure of whether it's accurate or not, just because somebody decided that this was the one.
Sure.
My classmates who were Christian and a little more, I don't want to categorize their belief, but more deeply Christian than I, were not happy with my question, but they really were not happy with the professor's answer, because the only answer to that is, yes, that's right. It's just that's what some people decided. There's no way to say what's right about this. There's no way to define what an accurate definition of the Trinity is.
So in other words, they were upset that the answer wasn't, this is correct because it is clearly true,
right,
and easily defensible, and it's that certainty idea again. They wanted to know for sure this was the right answer.
Yeah. So in terms of whether I have ever had a favorite part of the Trinity, I don't know that I can go back and say, oh, at this point in time, Jesus was my favorite part of the Trinity, or God was or whatever. I do appreciate different things. I continue to appreciate different things about the way that the Trinity might be framed. I appreciate the idea of the natural world we inhabit as a vessel of the divine, and that would extend beyond the little planet that we walk around on. That there is something that I can look to that is greater than myself, that I am in relationship with, and that to me speaks to the Godhead part of the Trinity. But there's also this exemplar that shows up in the Jesus stories about what it means for a human being to walk around being divine. And I know that a lot of people would say that that sets Jesus apart as a unique thing, a unique creation that nobody can live up to. And I kind of think of the Jesus stories as being the aspirational piece of it, that you cannot be the creator of the universe. That's not something that a human being can be. But you can be a person who walks around and embodies divinity or embodies the life-affirming values that you hold so deeply that you become the incarnation of the divine in the world. And to me, the Holy Spirit is that piece of us that is, that spark of divinity within us, that inherent worthiness, that deepest, most noble self, that part of us that continually calls us back to integrity, that part of us that recognizes when we are behaving in a way that is antithetical to who we want to be in the world, and gives us those pangs, those internal pangs of friction that say, this is not okay, what I'm doing right now is not okay with me. That is very much a Holy Spirit kind of paradigm. So I still see some value in those, the way that we might frame that. And also, there are some polytheists in our congregation and in our larger community that I think there's a lot of merit to thinking of things in some kind of partitions, which aspect of the divine am I needing right now? Do I need to call upon this particular god or goddess or however we want to frame it in my life right now? Or is there a different one that is going to be psychologically aligned with what I need and what I want to express in this moment? So I think that there are a lot of ways that we can be expansive in our theological framing without necessarily believing in the way that some people think of believing in.
I'm just going to say what that word exactly means. What do we mean by believing in? So
yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And that invitation to think about these questions in terms of what is meaningful to us and the way that we frame this, to me, is a real, talk about an element of liberation. We get to have all the freedom in the world to think about these undefinable. We can't quite decide on all of them because they're by definition not answerable. When you have the liberty to just explore, then the framing is well, what's interesting about this framing, as opposed to, is this correct or not correct? So that's important.
So the burning question at this point is, what do you mean when you say you are a Trinitarian?
Unitarian. So what I will say is that as we were just talking about all of this, I am really, really trying not to instinctively put my professor cap on and start talking about so many different things, and especially bring up the polytheism question, which is absolutely important. And there's all this recent scholarship about actually how Judaism is probably polytheistic in certain ways all throughout this period. So there's all this really interesting stuff that's sort of at play. But to address that question, what do I mean by saying I'm a Trinitarian Unitarian? What I will say is that I find Trinitarian theology meaningful. That framing is interesting to me, and this question does allow me to get to at least part of that in a way that I think is eliminating for even those of us who might think that this idea of this doctrine is pretty silly, which is, well, I guess I'll start by saying, to me, what's interesting about framing the Trinity as an idea, especially one so powerful that a group of Unitarians had to sort of respond to it, is that it is an interesting thing I do think theologians do, which is often they have to come up with resolutions to problems that people who created the problems didn't know they were creating. Mm-hmm. Like, in a very real sense, the doctrine of the Trinity is because a bunch of people wrote about their experience of Jesus in a way that made it a problem to understand how that figure related to God. Mm-hmm. Because there's just all this language and it's just never clear. And I think any objective take on that is that there is not a coherent vision of this in any of the early Christian text, like what's in the Bible in particular. And so no surprise that theologians shoot out ideas, and there are, just as you described, Reverend Randy, so many competing ideas. But when I think about the Trinitarian doctrine, as I try to with all kinds of things, you want to look for like the best expression of it. Like, you don't want to look for the weird defensive one, or like, the argumentative one. You're looking for the sort of most coherent and the best version of that thing. And for me, that is expressed by, there are three Greek theologians from the 4th, 5th centuries, often referred to as the Cappadocian theologians, because they're all from the same area in what's modern day Turkey. And their work is to try to sort of nail this down in some coherent way. And one of the ways that one of them, whose name is Gregory of Nazianzus, defines this is to describe God as dynamic movement. And that there is a trinity because each of these entities are constantly in connection with one another. They're related in specific ways, but it's like a wheel that is constantly in movement. And the term that Gregory of Nazianzus, who's from provincial Turkey, uses is a very pagan term, actually. It's the pagan term for like feastal rural dances. It's the chorea. This is like big circling dances. There are versions, I would say, you could still see, like if you go to like the Greek festival in the late summer, things like that. Some of these traditions, they're probably not identical, but they're similar.
Lots of different individuals in the dance, but but they're never in the same place, and they're always in motion. And the circle itself becomes a thing apart from the individual dancers.
Exactly. So in Gregory of Nazianzus' model of the Trinity, that thing is it's perichoresis is the term that is used for this constant movement. And then with the idea of just as you mentioned, of the particular roles of each of those players, the role then of Jesus and the role of the Holy Spirit this is where, again, it gets very meaningful to me, is to open that circle and to invite us into that dance. With the whole idea being, of course, that like this is a kind of becoming divine, like this is participating in the divine life. And so I loved reading this question, because what I was excited to answer was to say my favorite part of the Trinity is not the members, it's the dance, it's the actual movement, which to me is the kind of thing, in terms of framing, that suddenly then could inform all kinds of ways of talking about our participation in the world. And what I will note is that if anyone has made good hay out of the Trinity in the last 50 years or so, it's liberation theologians who have talked about a community with God that is modeled in these Trinitarian ways, very much in a social justice orientation. So if I have no designs or expectations to create any other Trinitarian Unitarians, I'm happy to be alone on that. But if I was going to pose something about it, it would be the idea that sometimes these things that we think of as arcane and kind of dead letter doctrinal things, they're only that way because we don't make meaning out of them. And it's fine if you don't want to make meaning out of something. That's completely fine. But if you do, well, then it's meaningful because you chose to make it meaningful. So in that sense, I am a Trinitarian Unitarian.
What I love about your describing the whole being the more important part to you than the pieces of it, it really does capture this sense of interdependence and interrelationship that we might not have other divine or scriptural or sacred exemplars for, depending on what we lean on for our sacred, as a sacred text or whatever that might be for us, our individual scriptures. And it kind of combats this toxic sense of individuality that we live with. It's like we have to completely regulate ourselves. And the reality is that mammals, not just people, but mammals are born into relationships.
Absolutely.
We have co-regulating existence from the first breath to the last. And if we are looking at a Trinity, then we might say, even God is in relationship. It's not this individual, existence. It's an interrelated, co-regulating entity.
Yeah.
And so it's a very interesting thing. Not that I'm going to start preaching on that next week.
I would be scared if you did. So.
But it does say something about our humanity
Absolutely.
To frame it in that way.
Yeah, and thinking about that, this is again why God is such a useful topic for our spiritual imaginings, like why the concept of God can be helpful, is whatever that thing is primarily that thing. And so I think often many religious traditions want to imagine God in very static, uniform terms, like there's sort of like a monad. This is like it's complete. It's Aristotle referred to a self-thinking mind, like that, which to me I'm like, fantastic! What a great useless metaphysical entity we've created that's out there thinking about itself. Great. It's like numbers, like a big calculator just sort of reflecting on itself. So I think any of the models that we're talking about here, wherever we might find them, in this case we were posed about the Trinity, which is one space, but there's, you mentioned polytheistic models and other ways of thinking about it. If we can find ways to make that dynamic interconnection that you're describing, if we see that as foundational, then we're not going to try to resolve ourselves. We're going to try to reach out further. And to me, that's a really powerful idea.
Well, and hopefully it's a powerful enough idea for listeners, because we're going to be reaching out further to invite some other voices into this conversation.
Absolutely.
After this episode. We've kind of wrapped up our Ask Us Anything questions.
That's right.
And so our next question is going to be asking you all what your spiritual practices are and how you make meaning in your life as a result, and maybe some of the same exact questions that Valerie posed to us.
For sure, absolutely. And if I can just say, I'm so excited to hear about this because we have such engaged and interesting people. I feel like there's just such interesting ways to imagine this conversation going. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from so many others about their own spiritual lives, their own spiritual practices.
Well, if you are interested in being a part of that conversation, do not wait for us to reach out to you. Reach out to either Alan or myself and let us know that you want to have a little conversation with us about some spiritual practice that you find meaningful. And you might be first up in our next season as we consider where this little experiment might go.
I can't wait to learn from all of our wonderful people.
And in the meantime, thanks for listening, and I hope you create something beautiful today.
See you soon.